we know from all these opinion polls that we've done and that others have done that even after October 7th, the basic outlines of Jewish politics didn't go anywhere. People who are left-leaning are still left-leaning, people who are right-leaning are still right-leaning, people who are centrist are still centrist. And yet a good chunk of us have sort of disappeared from the conversation in this polarization. Part of the solution of fixing that kind of discourse is reasserting ourselves, showing ourselves that we're there. But it's a test of some of the things that we're going to talk about on this panel, a test of pluralism, a test of leadership, a test of representation. Part of fixing our communal discourse rests on having better leaders and being better Jewish leaders, and surfacing the leaders who have been good and need to see that. We need to see them. So on this panel, our Canadian Jewish leaders have already been doing that in a variety of different arenas. In politics, in communal life, between clergy, interpersonally. So first let me introduce, I guess I'll go from this end over to me, Cantor Cheryl Wunch, spiritual leader of Congregation Shir Libeynu, and a member of NIFC's News of Canada's Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet. We have Karen Kollins, the director of Canada for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. We have the Honorable Yara Sachs, who you heard already earlier, former Canadian Member of Parliament and Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. And Stephen Pincus, senior partner at Goodmans law firm, also founder and chair of Kaleidoscope, as well as having served on a number of boards and organizations like Bialik Hebrew Day School, the Jewish Agency, many others. What I want to dive right in, like we're done sort of we get it. We've been at this conference for half a day already. We got our 2 o'clock coffee, our 3 o'clock coffee, and our croissants. We're ready for the last sugar dose of the day to tackle one of the really tough conversations. Let's get into it just by going through in sort of a pre-planned order. Let's wade into this piece by piece. And Cheryl, I wanted to start with you first, because your work as a Jewish communal spiritual leader of a community, you have a flock, you have such a responsibility of unpacking the moment for many people. And so would you unpack for us where this all begins? What does Jewish leadership mean for a person in your shoes? Especially for Jewish leaders who have their own views. I mean, really, who of us doesn't have our own views? But you're also responsible for others. So help us open up the conversation, starting with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this day. Ben, you've put so much work into all of this, and I just want you to know that we all appreciate everything that has come from you and your team. And thank you. We are absolutely a room of friends here, so I'm going to breathe a little bit and know who I'm speaking with. And talk about what it takes to be a good Jewish leader in these times. And I'm not saying that I know all the answers, but this is just what I've been thinking about. And I really think it begins with being honest about the moment we're in. Right now, there is, as I'm sure you have all felt, a tension, a push and pull between what our community needs and wants to hear, or what they think they need and want to hear. And as leaders, what our own hearts and guts are telling us. And all of that tension is against a backdrop of a community in pain. And we know that pain breeds fear, and it breeds panic, and it breeds anger. And that anger often turns inward, and we yell at each other, and people are targeted for saying anything that doesn't fit the loudest message. And that's the reality that we hold as Jewish leaders in Canada today. A community that's in so much pain that we're no longer able to listen to each other. But I also want to point out that alongside that reality, hope comes in the quiet moments. When someone comes to talk to me, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this too, they come and they're nervous and they have this look of, I don't know, I want to talk about it, but I don't know if I'm safe to do so. And to be able to say, it's okay, you can talk about however you're feeling, I'm here for you. And there's this moment of like breathing and relaxing and humanizing when someone says, I'm not going to get yelled at if I don't say the popular thing. And that's where I believe leadership has to begin. Not with answers, but with the courage to create spaces of safety where people can breathe and speak their truth. And I think that's especially important in a synagogue community like mine. Diverse politically, diverse generationally, and diverse in levels of Jewish connection. We have people in our congregation that lean almost every direction, and many don't know which direction they lean in anymore. And what everyone is longing for, and I believe what most of us in this room are longing for, is connection and meaning. So my job is not to convince people to see things my way. My job is to remind us that we can disagree without harming each other. If you were in the anti-Semitism panel this morning, I said that ideas are fair game for critique, people are not. And that is so hard to remember. We can listen, we can hold space, and try to understand, even when agreement isn't possible. At the very least, we can learn to empathize. But how do you put that into practice? That's the challenge, right? And for me, it's naming that tension, just being honest about it, not avoiding it. Being willing to say that what I'm about to say you might not agree with, and I want to hear from you gently and calmly, and I want to understand where you're coming from. Or even saying, hey, I'm struggling with this too. It can open up a dialogue. And it lets people know that they don't have to have armor on when they come to talk. So now to answer your actual question, if I had to paint a picture of what good Jewish leadership looks like in Canada, it would be leaders who can sit with people in their pain, leaders who dare to hold complexity, even when it would be so much easier to simplify, leaders who help us return again and again to our moral center, that human life is sacred, that empathy matters, and that we're responsible for each other. Leaders who are brave enough to speak hard truths to donors and funders, to resist being swayed by the loudest voices, and instead to ground their communities in Torah, in values, and in moral courage.
And that's your Yom Kippur sermon? Great. Shir Libeynu, everyone, just in a couple weeks. That transitions us well to Karen. I'm really pleased that you're here with us today because the Shalom Hartman Institute has been doing some incredible work, which is, I would argue, largely unknown across the whole community. If you ask people on the street, what's the state of Jewish public discourse, they would say, oh, it's horrible, nobody can talk to anybody. And actually, they are talking to each other. So I would love you, with many different kinds of Jews, I would love you to surface that work and tell us what that is, has been happening unbeknownst to all the rest of us.
Thank you so much, Ben. I thought you were going to say if you ask people on the street what the Shalom Hartman Institute is, they would say it's a podcast. So thank you, Ben. And as Cheryl said, so many friends in the room. It really is amazing to be among friends from so many different parts of our work and my life, but also this work, so many leaders here, rabbis, lay leaders, leaders of other faith communities who are here, who have been touched and have been part of the network of the Shalom Hartman Institute. I'm very grateful to be here, and Ben, thank you for inviting me, and I'm exceptionally honored to lead the work of the Institute across Canada. I've been doing this work now for 4 years. As many of you for sure know the Shalom Hartman Institute, but maybe, as Ben said, are not familiar with the work that we're doing locally and the work we're doing across the country. The Institute itself is very broad. We have a hub in Jerusalem, a hub in North America, really in our head office in New York. But we also have regional centers across North America. And what we do going also, Cheryl, on what you said, is we're really a place where we focus on aspiration. We ask the question of what is the community, the Israel, the world, the connection between the two that we hope for, and how can we bring leaders together to consider that together, and leaders from across difference. So ultimately, at the core of the Hartman Institute is we are a research center and a think tank for the Jewish people. It's a big aspiration. And our work is premised really on the notion that Jewish history has been shaped by the strength of our leaders and the power of ideas. So if you think about Jewish history, those two pieces, the leaders and the ideas they hold, are really what makes it and what shapes it. And that ideas can actually change the world. So the Institute focuses on these ideas and brings ideas to leaders in all their realm, from teens upward, up through adults and of all ages. And the core commitments of the Institute are that we focus on strengthening the foundations of Jewish identity, deepening the connection between Israel and world Jewry, and advancing the values of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And we do that all considering pluralism and within a pluralistic setting with multiple voices. And if you do listen to our podcasts, you'll hear those multiple voices and that push and pull against each other. And through our work of our scholars in the Research Center, we bring ideas and responses to the challenges that leaders face around the world. And for me, that work is here across Canada, but I want to speak specifically about our work in Toronto, which is how I met Ben through that work in Toronto. And I'll also say, I hear from people a lot who say, David Hartman was my rabbi in Montreal. So I want to name that one of the most wonderful parts of my work has been meeting people who historically were impacted by Rabbi David Hartman, whether it was at the Bailey Shul in Montreal, or through his work once he made Aliyah in the 70s and founded the Institute. And so many of the initial supporters of the Institute, they were Canadians. So while my position coming on in this role only 4 years ago, I was the first Canadian there are other Canadians, but Canadian professional living in Canada focused on Canada. And I don't think anybody then really considered the impact of the work of what it also would mean to bring Hartman to Canada, and the specificity and the nuance of what it meant for Hartman scholars to teach in Canada. And so the most amazing part of my role has been to work with our scholars and to help them understand when they come and teach in Canada what that means, that we are different, that there is a nuance. So here in Canada, the work has been broad. I'll talk specifically about the work in Toronto, which came out of when I started in 2021. We held a leadership convening from multitude of pluralistic voices of leaders, rabbis, lay leaders, communal professionals in Toronto. And we had multiple conversations to figure out what could Hartman's place be here. And what we heard loud and clear was, this is a very well-resourced Jewish community. And often Hartman works in communities, in smaller communities in the United States, helping them think about what it means to be a vibrant Jewish community. We have vibrancy here. But what we were told, what came out of those consultations, was what Hartman can do is help bring people together across difference. We're a vibrant community, but we live in our silos, we live in our echo chambers. And this was coming from across denominational and political voices across the city. So that's what we did. So
I just saw a bunch of people nodding their heads. They're
okay.
Like, oh yeah.
Oh yeah. So that's what we did. So for the last 2 years, we're moving into our third year. We developed 2 cross-communal learning cohorts. Again, Hartman is an educational institution. We focus on learning. And if you come to a Hartman program, our programs are rooted in text, both traditional and contemporary. One does not have to come with any background in text study, but that's the source and the core of our work. And so we convened 2 cohorts, one a senior communal professionals cohort and one a lay leaders cohort. And I went out to across our community, across denominational, political, geographic, all of those age, all of those lines. And we've put together, we're moving into our third year, those two cohorts where Hartman scholars who travel to Toronto, only after I've taught them about what it means to come here, who teach to our cohorts, and they learn with us over the course of a year. Some examples of the classes, what we talk about models of community. We talk about power and vulnerability. We talk about living as Jews in a modern world. And around our table, from this community, and there are many in this room that have been in those around that table or who are joining us in this coming year, are representatives from the Haredi community, are representatives from our downtown shuls, are representatives from organizations like J-Space Canada and New Israel Fund, and I could go on and on and on. And so when we talk about bridging difference and people speaking to one another, and I'll say this, it's not political. So I'll just give one little story and then to share. When we started this, the first of these cohorts, it was during the judicial reform. And one of the Orthodox rabbis who I have built a relationship with, he said, I will support this and I'm going to nominate a lay leader. But he had heard some of the things that were coming out from certain people in the Institute in Israel around judicial reform, and he wasn't happy with what was, wasn't not happy, it wasn't his cup of tea. And he said, but I don't want you to focus on Israel. Focus on community, focus on building bridges, focus on understanding each other. And that was right before October 7th, and our first session was on October 21st, 2023. And now we were in this position where, and our first faculty member was an Israeli, and we were going to talk about Israel. We had to talk about Israel. And it was so poignant because it showed that how we were in this moment where as a community, we were together. We were together. It was, 2 weeks after the devastation, and we were all together. And here we were learning about each other. And it wasn't about Israel. It was about community. It was about how I could talk across the room and understand someone else and talk about assumptions. We asked a question among our lay leaders. What's an assumption that you think other people around this table make about you that isn't true? And the things that came up were unbelievable. I won't go into all the details, happy to share later. And so I'll just say that's a big part of the work here in Toronto. We also have a teen fellowship. We have an alumni of our teen fellowship here in the room. Aviv, we're happy you're here. And the Teen Fellowship, which is a North American-wide program, has 380 teens in it this coming year. 25 of them are from Canada, from across Canada, and those numbers are growing. And those teens are learning in the same way that our adults were, and they are bridging across difference. Our cohort from Toronto that's meeting tomorrow for the first time has members who go to Chat, who go to B'nai Akiva schools, who go to private non-Jewish schools, and who go to public schools. That is who we're bringing together, and those are all teens from Toronto. So we're very proud to be able to bring these multiple voices together, and we want to ensure that not just Israelis and North Americans don't disconnect from one another, but that locally here, that we talk to one another, and that we don't walk away from each other.
And I think that's very heartening for people to hear that actually, from the Haredi community to secular to and all the other ones, like there are substantive conversations happening between very, very surprising leadership. And again, it's not getting the attention right now, and partly because those leaders probably would not do that if they were publicly scrutinized for doing so. But part of this conference is about elevating the people who are doing things that are good, already doing well. And the two examples that we've heard about is like, how do you increase pluralism? How do you create a space for dialogue across difference? Stephen, I want to go to you next. We'll come back to you, Yara. I have a long wind up for you. You want to take the microphone? I want to broach a slightly different angle of this conversation because yes, it's critically important for good Jewish leadership to hold the space for all kinds of Jews. And that's, I think, if we had one big ask of the Jewish community is, we have our political perspectives or our approach to Israel are here, we're not going anywhere, and we would like to be included. But also part of this polarization that we've been seeing is this like weakness in the middle of Canadian Jewry. Particularly progressive Zionists like ourselves, but I would also argue among many centrists. We need to be pluralistic, but we also need to assert ourselves. And we need to not just ask politely for our place in communal discourse, but to step up to the table, unasked, to be there. And you've been a part of building several Canadian Jewish initiatives, like the Hatikva slate, like Kaleidoscope, which is purposefully adding things that are missing to the communal discourse. And you've also got a foot in some of the more establishment world. You've been a leader in institutions like Bialik and the Jewish Agency. Why do you think progressive Zionist voices need to be strengthened in Canada? Why have you been doing that? And can we really expect those big institutions to really include us?
All right, well, let me just firstly second what Cheryl said about this conference that you put together, which is really amazing. This is a big deal for Toronto, I think. People talk about the film festival, but this is something. I think that's perhaps the place to start. This is something unusual that Haaretz would have their conference here. And this theme that seems to be running through the conversation so far that Karen and Cheryl have been focused on about being able to talk to each other is one that goes very deep for me, and that's why we started Kaleidoscope. So you mentioned Kaleidoscope and Hatikva. I want to sort of contrast the two maybe as two kind of different sides of a coin here, and at the same time perhaps bring a bit of an elephant into the room here. So we started Kaleidoscope 10 years ago with this premise that it was about bringing people from the left and the right together and going to Israel, doing an Israel program where we could see all sides of Israel. We would speak to Haredim and settlers. We would speak to Palestinians. We went to Ramallah. We spoke to every part of society. And we looked at politics. We looked at culture. We looked at business, healthcare, law, civil rights, social activism, and so on. And we've been doing this now for 10 years. Just a quick commercial. We got our next trip's 19th to the 23rd of October, a month from now. And we still got some spots. Anybody wants to join? I see some people in the audience who've been on it, Michael, Lorraine, and so on. And it's a pluralist in the deepest sense, a pluralist vision. Looking at everything, and it's not a mission. We call it an unmission. It's not about telling people what to think. It's certainly not like a federation mission or friends of any organization. It's meant to look at everything. Okay. Now, we also have a magazine, by the way. We started a quarterly last year called Kaleidoscope magazine. Same ethos. Anybody here is welcome to just look at kaleidoscopemagazine.org. You can read it for free, and you can write for it for free as well. And it's trying to get away from sort of some of the dumbed down stuff in the social media and this vitriol and all of that. Okay. But something's happened, and it's happened all over the world, and it's been growing, since, let's say, the last 10, 15 years. Some people refer to it in terms of the rise of populism, the rise of authoritarian leadership, and of course that coincided with the rise of a very far-right government in Israel at the end of 22, and of course October 7th, and we're in a different world. And frankly, when I'm listening to Cheryl and Karen talking, I'm saying here, yes, but, and the but is that it's no more about left and right. I mean, those are constructs, but those constructs aren't very helpful. It's about two visions. And the one vision is the vision that I think we're talking about in this room and this whole conference. That's why I say I want to start with what this conference is about. It's a vision of openness and tolerance and pluralism and respect for knowledge and delving into information and trying to do better and, frankly, ethical leadership. And we are up against a completely different vision. It's an authoritarian, messianic, closed, intolerant vision that threatens to upset and subvert the pluralism that we are promoting. And this paradox, which those people who've read any ethical philosophy. If you think back to Karl Popper, he called the paradox of pluralism. And the paradox is like this. We can have a big tent. We can make this a really big tent. And we're very proud in the community. We talk the whole time about a big tent. But what happens when people who we let into the tent, or in fact who are holding up the tent, actually are turning the tent upside down and are saying that there's only one way? The Israeli government is right no matter what. We in the diaspora cannot take a stand on the Israeli government. There's a judicial coup, and we are the only federation, the Toronto Federation, the only major North American federation that refused to take a stand against the judicial coup October 7th, 23. Just one example. Now, I'll give you mentioned Hatikva. Okay, so Hatikva, there was the first World Zionist Congress election in Canada in the past 20 years, living memory for most of us. We suddenly had this exposure to Zionism and what it's all about. There were 9 slates, and Hatikva was the only independent slate for a democratic Israel. And by independent, I mean we were not affiliated with a particular synagogue movement. We came into it with expectation of maybe being lucky to scrape by with one mandate. And we ended up with 3 mandates together with our pluralist partners in the Reform and Conservative Masorti movements. We got a majority of the voters in the election. That lines up completely with your study, and I tell your studies that over the last number of years that show that a majority of Canadian Jewish community are pluralists, are in that camp of what I've referred to sort of the first camp, the open camp that belongs here at this Haaretz conference. And yet, in our journey, in our campaign, we went, and I won't name the names, but we went to a number of organizations who are pluralist, who promote pluralism, who promote openness, who have the same values for a liberal democratic Israel as we do. And they refused to promote us, refused out of fear that they would upset the other side, because we're pluralists. And if we're pluralists, how do we take a position? And how do we argue? We've got to sort of go into like turtles into the shell. And I think a lot of people are doing that everywhere when they see everything that's going on. So I won't say any more about it now because I know we're going to go around again, but we can talk then about where do we take that?
Thank you, Stephen. Again, we're moving in a progressive order from, we're progressive order. We're progressing in a progressive order from like the base need for pluralism and how do we ourselves hold multiple views and that we should be a part of a community conversation. And you've just broached one of the things which is really the toughest, which is when we can say that we want pluralism, but there's some people in the community who completely disagree with what we would term pluralism. And there's some more strenuous views out there that like just really want to exclude us. And they don't care for pluralism. So it's a way of getting to Yara. I'm so glad you're up here to share your perspective because I can't think of any other Canadian Jewish leader who have stepped forward as publicly as a progressive Zionist in such a toxic environment and cut the trail for so many other people. You talk about a natural tension in your work between trying to have your own views and also trying to hold space for others while facing let's call it the poison machine, the toxic atmosphere, particularly from some quarters, that is incredibly fraught. And actually, we've layered it all up. How do we lead in that space?
First of all, Ben, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel in particular because I feel like the path to me becoming a Jewish leader in federal politics is actually surrounded by the people who are sitting with me on this panel. Ben, as you know, I have been an active supporter of New Israel Fund and New Israel Fund Canada for decades. And it actually became a foil when I was in my by-election. They were like, she sat on the committee for communications for New Israel Fund Canada. So I think we need to be, it just started there. And I was a Hartman Fellow back in the day when I lived in Israel and worked in Israeli politics. And, it has shaped so much of who I am in being a Jewish woman and an Israeli woman. We live in a country where multiculturalism is a fact. It's something we talk about proudly. We say diversity is a fact in this country and inclusion is a choice. And yet when I put up my hand as an unapologetic Zionist who also believes that a Palestinian state should come into existence and a two-state solution, even in my first round at putting my hand up, the tension was there. The tension was there. There was fear, like, ooh, what's she going to do? And I said, I'm going to bring everyone to the table. I am not going to apologize for being a Zionist, and I'm not going to apologize in saying that a safe and secure Israel is won alongside a Palestinian state. And that the status quo that we have seen under the Netanyahu governments, successive governments, this policy of containment, I like to call it, is not sustainable. We know it. We've seen it. October 7th is the proof of that. And we can't hide from those things. So, my journey to becoming a Jewish voice in Canada really started in my synagogue and at Hartman and with NIF. And I think at one point, Kaleidoscope did ask me to write an article at one point. But the point being that, and I am coming. So if you come on this trip, you'll be joining me and Maytal and others for what should be really an important time to be there. But what I learned when you got to the federal level is the power of convening. And I learned this from Jean Chrétien, who said, the most power you have at the federal level is to bring everyone to the table. And when I got there, and it was still COVID, so the table was virtual. So how do you bring everyone together? And then Francois Philippe, and it was a time where UN votes were shifting somewhat, but they were shifting in response to what was happening on the ground in Israel and with regards to settlement expansion. And we were threading through this very carefully. And at the time, it was the Foreign Affairs Minister was Francois Philippe Champagne. And he said to me, Yara, you're like a new, fresh voice here. I want to have a stakeholder meeting with the Jewish community. Who should we bring? And that's where the shift started. And this is the power of convening. So we have what we call at the federal level the frequent flyers of stakeholders, the usual people that we consult with, whether it was CJA or federation heads and so on. And I said, I want New Israel Fund, ARTSA, and Canadian Friends of Peace Now at the table. And Francois Philippe's team was like, okay, sure. And so we prepared the invitations, and they went out. And I'm not going to lie, CJA was outraged, B'nai B'rith was outraged, the federations were outraged. They said, this can't be, we represent the majority. And as we know, thanks to the many surveys that we have, well, no, you don't. And I am an elected official who doesn't share your majority view, so I'd like to see more voices at the table because I have the power to convene. That's what Jewish leadership at the federal level should look like. But it takes work, and it takes constant effort of having your finger on the pulse of everyone around you. It's a noisy space at the federal level. We are hearing from everyone. Julie described some of the emails this morning that we received. There can be thousands of them in a day. And a friend said to me once after October 7th when I was, and I've held the positions that I've held for years. There were nothing new. I would have constituents say to me, I voted for you, you should do X. And I said, but I was always transparent with you with what my position would be. It's never changed. It's been unwavering. It is clear as day for me in the work that I do. And I was voted by the electorate to hold that position, and I will stay true to myself, not only because I'm a good politician, but because I'm true to myself as a good human. And we have to be able to hold that place. So as a Jewish leader, it's really easy to get thrown about. And, everyone will come to you as with their problems, or as my grandmother would say, with their pekalech. And you have to, so one is to convene, but two is to listen. To listen without judgment, to listen and hold space. You have to do that as a member of parliament. And when you're escalated to the level of cabinet, you're not only holding your constituents who elected you, you're holding Canadians. And you're holding Canadians who are grappling with really, really hard things. As the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, I was dealing with the opioid crisis, with tens of thousands of overdose deaths, of broken families and broken communities here at home. And yet I had members of the Jewish community saying to me, you must resign from cabinet, because as a Jewish woman, how dare you stay in cabinet? And I looked at them and I said, but what about all the families who are struggling with addiction? Do they not matter? What about all the families and communities across this country where they are worried about their young people and their mental health in a post-COVID world? Do they not matter? What about all the health issues and women? I was also Associate Health Minister. I was being confronted with what was happening down south in terms of women's sexual and reproductive health rights. What about them? And it became this singular issue that when you say to yourself as a Jewish leader, you must convene, you must listen, but you also have to hold true to your true North Star. And without that, you can be thrown about in what is a tumultuous space in this polarization, but holding true to yourself is really where it starts at the federal level, I would say.
I think we're coming back around to Karen, because I think we've laid out we just got the context, we got it all. We have a community in pain that needs spaces to talk about it. They're afraid to do so. We've talked about word policing all day long. There's a need for Jewish leadership to talk to each other. There's also a need to create what isn't present. We need to assert ourselves in the conversation. And there's a political arena which is particularly nasty and really hard to deal with, but there's also success and good things there too. We'll come back around and return to, I'm sort of picking up Stephen's question of okay, so how do we do pluralistic leadership in that landscape? From your perspective at an institution that's not about the politics, but about community connection. What's the 202 answer of what Shalom Hartman is doing, and how do you see it?
So I'll give, in true Hartman style, a Hartman framing. As I said, Hartman gives framing and ideas for leaders to think about the challenges they're grappling with. So as Yara and Stephen you were speaking, I was thinking about a framing that Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, has given, where he talks about hot pluralism and cold pluralism. And we've used this with some of our leaders, actually, that we've worked with across from some of Canada's smaller communities. And pluralism for them in the smaller communities they have different challenges when it comes to pluralism in their communities. Hot pluralism being, or let's start with cold pluralism. Cold pluralism being probably, Stephen, what you're talking about when people think about, all the voices are at the table, right? We have different representations. It's cold, it's toned down, it's more about avoiding conflict. It's muted and it's focused on safety concerns, right? Everybody's there, everyone's at the table. But it's not real pluralism. Hot pluralism is that which is passionate, engaged, where we move into, as Yara, you said about convening really the uncomfortable conversations, being able to bring people around the table and bring people into the room. And it's okay to not agree with one another. So I want to offer that framing as something for us, the hot pluralism is the direction that we would go in terms of for something to be real pluralism, which we think about as an engaged relationship across difference. Again, the work that we do, we're not bringing leaders from across the landscape of Jewish life in Toronto together to argue what their differences are. That's not the purpose. The purpose is by building bridges and having them better understand someone else's perspective, and not politics comes in sometimes, but that's not the crux of it. It's their commitment, what tradition means to them, what modernity means to them, how they grapple with those in the worlds that they live. By doing that, that's how we build a stronger and more vibrant Jewish community, so that in moments of celebration as a community, we can all be there to celebrate. And in moments of collective trauma and concern, like on October 7th, we can all be there to hold each other up and have everybody there. We also talk about pluralism, tolerance, and deviance. And this is, I think, also where the limits come in a little bit in terms of some of the limits to pluralism. So again, tolerance being that cold pluralism, and pluralism itself being more of hot pluralism, and the idea of deviance, that there are limits. And I think there are limits to pluralism, and every community needs boundaries. Not all ideas or actions are admissible, but pluralism cannot extend so far that voices deny the legitimacy of somebody else or the dignity of somebody else, or behaviors that cause violence or hatred or political violence, right? Micha Goodman, I recently heard him. I was not on a Hartman podcast. He was on another podcast. And I think he was quoting Jonathan Haidt, if I'm not mistaken. And he talked about polarization being a mind virus. And that this mind virus is when your mind cannot see that there are two irreconcilable camps, one good and one evil, and you sit on one of those sides. And that polarization, as that mind virus, is really a collapse of curiosity, right? Where we just shut it down, we're no longer interested. And I think the antidote or the vaccine to that is pluralism. That when we can see each other and acknowledge the difference, somebody else's perspective, their point of view, with their lived experience, where they're coming from, that's where we, in this world of polarization, can bring things much closer together. And it's slow. I think it's slow work. It's long-term work. And I'm very proud of the leaders who are doing this work, whether it's with Hartman or elsewhere. And we've seen so many of those today throughout the day.
I want to ask one thing here. I think what's so interesting about the vision of pluralism, the tools used to advance a conversation of pluralism, in the Shalom Hartman curriculum and the teaching. I mean, I did the professionals cohort last year, and I have such immense respect already for the Shalom Hartman Institute, and Daniel Hartman is my prophet. Yossi Klein Halevi is not my prophet. Rabbi Daniel Hartman is my prophet. But when the teachers came to speak to us, I'm not saying anything that Yossi Klein Halevi has not said publicly, but he said to our group of leaders, this is not the Holocaust. We need to take the temperature down a bunch. And I felt that there are voices in the room, very powerful voices, almost maybe a majority of people who had spoken up at that time, who really were adding to the hyperbole. And it was the teaching and the teachers who really were like, can we have a reality check? And I thought that is an extra part of the importance of what Shalom Hartman is doing. There's a depth of teaching and historical perspective that the scholars are bringing. And I think it's not just like, there's a bunch of us around the table. Why is that important? Or is it important? Or is it just because there's a bunch of scholars who are particularly strong-willed folks at your...
Well, they are pretty good.
Yeah.
I think it is important. I think that this idea, it's fascinating to me, having come into this work, the idea of really bringing text into everything that we do. And again, everybody coming across around that table from different perspectives, different educational backgrounds, but we're showing that, and what a big part of what is shown by these teachers is that these very disagreements, this discontent, these arguments are in our tradition. And so we as a community we should not be afraid to bring this to the surface. It's in our tradition, it is who we are, it is what we do as a Jewish people, and it is what has made us strong. And we should continue that in our work as community and courageous leaders.
I agree. No, I think it's something about leaders themselves being pushed. There's something about leading and not just following your flock that I think has come up a number of times. Stephen, there was more that you wanted to say about the challenge of pluralism. So I want to give you that opportunity to
let me
get deeper into what do we mean by that.
Yeah, so let's just look at what, again, I mentioned there's sort of two sides here to the work. And I love the comment you made now about curiosity, imagination. I also want to just say the obvious, which is that nothing's static. And I think of Yossi Kleiner Levy, he's moved. Everybody's moved. And moving is not bad. Moving is good. Being able to move is good. And I've been through my own journeys and seen a lot of different parts of the community over here. And I can say that I've seen a lot of parts of the community, right from the ultra-Orthodox right across the spectrum to from the inside. And that's, I think, important. I think people need to listen and need to do all of this. But I think when we come back to this question of this moment, there's two types of things we can do. If we want to walk out of here and say, like, okay, this is all very well, it's nice to hear this, like, what's next? So, and that's why when you come picking up again on Kaleidoscope and on Hatikva. So the one is what I'd call activism. And that could be anything. It could be signing a petition. It could be going to a protest. It could be volunteering in an organization here, an organization in Israel. It could be it's doing.
Yara said political campaign. Hint.
I was going to get to politics, and that's why I'm saying Hatikva. That was a exercise, and the exercise there was to try and see how many people in the Canadian Jewish community would identify themselves as Zionists. That's a whole another discussion, as we've been having today. It's a moving target. What is a Zionist today? Where your survey shows that, there's a big difference between people who support Israel, close to 100% of the community, and people who identify today as a Zionist, only about half of the community. That's a whole different discussion. But, that being part of politics, that's all activism. And I think it's really important because, they say that you don't create action from hope. You create hope from action. And this is really about I think, again, we talk about these two different visions. It's the vision based on fear, and it's the vision based on hope. And I think what we're talking about today, there's all this fear looming in the background. But the reason everybody came to this conference today is because somewhere inside them they say there's hope. Otherwise, they wouldn't come to a NIF J-Space Haaretz conference, right? So, but the other side, and this I want to go back then to what Karen was talking about with what Hartman does and what we have been trying to do with Kaleidoscope and with other organizations, and that's about education. So there's activism and there's education. And I think you can't have the one without the other. And I think at the end of the day, what we have, again, global issue, authoritarianism, populism, etc., the only antidote to that is education. We can do as much as we like in terms of the activism side, but for the longer term, and it's all about the young people. And I have to say, I just, have to say that when I see young people in the room, there's some here, it really gives me a good feeling. On Kaleidoscope, we always try and have about 20, 25%, although most of the people are kind of north of 50, but we're always trying to have the under 30s or under 35s. And they're the ones who are going to change the world at the end of the day. It's not my generation is going to change the world at this point. So we can help facilitate. And that's why what we're doing with our next venture with Kaleidoscope, actually, which we're just launching now, is something called Kaleidoscope Leadership Forum. There's more on that in the future. But I think training young leadership or building it, educating, is really the key work, along with the activism.
No, the situation we're facing now is a crisis of leadership. The number of Jews are here in our space, but what will it take us to be a part of our community conversation, to be visible and to be there? And I think one of the biggest things holding that back are you call them the deviants, some really toxic, unhealthy actors. I want to go to Yara, and then we'll close out with Cheryl, your thoughts on this. What do we do about the fact that a great many Jewish leaders who have good values, who are in a place to make a difference or to speak up or to create better spaces, are terrified, and they don't want to step forward because of the toxicity?
I think I'm probably the best person to answer this question in the Canadian context right now. One of my friends said to me in the maelstrom of all of this, if everyone's angry at you, you must be doing something right. I think there are two types of issues that come up with the toxicity that we're seeing. And one, yes, Karen, I agree with you, it's the deviants. It's like the gentleman that I had to issue a notice of cease and desist on social media because of the lies that he was perpetuating in the middle of my campaign, which were spurring people to show up at my front door banging and scaring my children. My volunteers had to wear body cams in Jewish neighborhoods. In my riding, I received death threats. I had to have police escorts to be able to knock doors. And it included Rebel News, who also did their own campaign over the course of a year to try and silence me. So in the face of that, I would say the more courageous you are, the angrier they get. And will I say that there were days that were always strong? No. There were days where it was really hard. I consider it abuse. I consider it political violence. I am happily recovering from that and enjoying time with my family now. But I'm not done. And I think we can't be done because hope is, as Stephen was saying, there's hope and there's action, but I look at it a little bit differently. Hope is strategic as well. And when we do that in policy, when we do that in politics, the New York Declaration and what was voted on at the UN yesterday is when hope is strategic. It's when the international community says, we will not waver from a two-state reality. Even if everything else has shifted on the ground, the vision has not. The rights of Israelis and Palestinians to live in safety, security, dignity, and self-determination has not. So in those environments of toxicity to the deviants, you keep going. But I want to talk about the silence in spaces because they are just as toxic and just as damaging as the deviants. We talk about, this is actually really hard, the unhealthy silence from Jewish leadership, that there was no one from the people that sit at your tables who stood up and said, a Jewish woman should not be vilified this way, even if we disagree. No one. They said it was politics. It's a blood sport. You should just take it. And to that I will say no. No. For the sake of my children, your grandchildren, for the sake of political discourse in this country, no. Because I have plenty of gray hair under here, and I'm not doing this for me. I do this for my children. Do you know how many young Jewish Canadians have come up to me? Young Muslim Canadians have come up to me and said, thank you for being the voice that saw everyone. Not always, I wasn't perfect. But thank you. Thank you for not politicizing tragedy. Thank you for not politicizing trauma. Thank you for being a voice that said, this cannot be. Well ahead of when yes. For going to Ramallah to meet with Mahmoud Abbas as a Jewish woman, as an Israeli woman, to stand up for what is the reality and the vision that should be. But that comes at a price when the majority stays silent, when Jewish leadership says, well, we don't do politics. If you're not going to do politics, then don't do Sinat Chinam.
Amen. And I think part of what makes that work, at least at the present, so alone, has been that only up until recently, with the advent of Maytal Kowalski starting at J Space Canada, has there been a balancing force at the political arena of this missing hole in the middle of a political voice of progressive Jews, liberal Jews, progressive Zionists, liberal Zionists, to be there and to fight for that. And to be the blocking back for people who are taking brave situations. Sometimes they need to be pushed, sometimes they need to be pulled, sometimes they need to be supported. But without that voice, you're often on your own. Like, it can't just be heads of synagogues. It should be heads of synagogues, but often who's going to kick the heads of synagogues in the butt to say, you have constituents who run the full spectrum. Some of your constituents love Yara to death. What's the deal? Embrace the pluralism that you yourself say. I think it comes from top and it comes from bottom. And so that's why I want to come back to Cheryl with for sort of the last words. What is, how do you think about unhealthy actors in a situation like today?
This is a really multi-layered question, but Yara, I just want to, I can't speak for my colleagues. I'm sorry. I always try to think about the human behind the rhetoric, and sometimes it works to pull someone aside and have a conversation. And I've seen it work and say, hey, the words you're saying are really strong. Can we actually talk about this person to person? And sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think we're thinking now about the times when it doesn't. And that's when we have to remember that our moral center isn't found by averaging out the extremes. And I think we're so tempted to do that. We want to be in between the two extremes. It's not where it is. Our moral center is the principles of human dignity and the value of human life, period, full stop. So I think the way that we deal with the bad actors is by giving voice to the good actors. And the people in this room and the people at this conference and so many people who would have wanted to be here today and they couldn't feel like they don't have a voice because we're not the loud extremes screaming and yelling. And I think one of the reasons why we created this clergy council for the New Israel Fund is so that we can show the Jewish community that there are people who hear you, who are with you, who get you. And if your community doesn't feel like a place that works for you, yes, push your clergy, push your boards, keep going. And if you feel like you're hitting your head against a wall, there are others. And sometimes we need to find people who will hear us. And so the more we give voice to the people who are doing the good work, the positive work, the coalition building, we will eventually be able to drown out those bad actors. And this is the hope, of course, because that's my job, is to look for the hope, is that we can elevate the good.
Please thank these brave, bold, strong, pluralistic Jewish leaders. You are heroes in our eyes. Please don't give up. These people need you. Okay, let's go to the main session.